Chapter 11. Doreen shook her head. "That's not true at all," she protested. She stood and placed the small chair out of the way, where Nan normally kept it. "But on that note, it's time for us to head home." Nan smiled. She shifted her hand in her pocket and pulled out something, reaching to give it to Doreen. Doreen frowned as her grandmother palmed something small in Doreen's hand. Nan waved her off. "Don't look at it now. You can look at it later." Shrugging, Doreen put it in her pocket, picked up Thaddeus, propped him on her shoulder, and put a leash on Muggs's collar. "Goliath, come on. It's time to go home." He opened one eye and looked at her, let the eyelid drop and stretched out farther. She groaned. "How come Goliath isn't trained like the other two?" "Oh, he is trained and he's trained you," Nan said on a laugh. Doreen looked both ways before she walked across the grass to the edge of the road, with Thaddeus and Muggs. Goliath, once he realized he was being left behind, bolted up and passed them. Nan stood and waited until they crossed the street, then called out, "It was lovely to see you today." Doreen turned and smiled. "It's always lovely to see you." And with a wave, she moved her odd family up the street toward the creek. On any given day, she'd much rather walk the path behind all the houses that led to the creek than to travel the streets. It was also much safer, considering Goliath wasn't leashed. Just the thought of trying to put that behemoth on a leash and get him to walk obediently beside her made her grin. "I should put you on a leash, shouldn't I, Goliath?" He ignored her, like he always did. It took them several minutes to get to the end of the block, and then around the corner to head toward the path that would eventually take her to the creek. But it was still a beautiful day. Yet it was late, as she'd stayed longer at Nan's than she had planned to. But that was okay. She had nothing taking up her time anymore. Doreen grabbed her cell phone from her pocket and dialed Mac's number. "Hey Mac. When do you want me to move your mother's begonia patch?" How about this weekend?" His voice sounded distracted, as if she'd caught him at a bad moment. "This is Thursday already, isn't it?" She smiled. "Yes. So, the day after tomorrow, I can meet you there. Is 9 in the morning a good time?" "Sure, but I can do it without you. That is, if you trust me to handle your mom's garden." "And can we actually work in the garden? Or is it off limits after what we found yesterday?" "I don't think that was a human bone, so yes, and I trust you to handle Mom's garden, no problem." His tone was more active, as if he'd switched his attention from whatever was on his desk to his phone call. "It's you I can't trust." "Hey," she gasped in outrage. He chuckled. "Meaning I can't trust you not to get into trouble. And if you'll be at my mom's house, I'd prefer you didn't get into trouble there. I'm trying to keep her world nice and peaceful." "Well, I wouldn't do anything on purpose." Still frowning, she checked the traffic as she crossed the last street. "Although I'm convinced that was a human bone we found there. And probably one of Betty's." "Don't go jumping to conclusions. We should have the lab results back in another day or two." Once on the other side, Muggs wanted to race around free. She bent down and unclipped the leash from his collar. "Can I bring the animals?" "I don't see any reason why not. It's probably better if you do. Otherwise they'll just follow you on their own." "True enough," she said. "We're walking back from Nan's now. Your mom's house is not very far." "Nothing is very far away in that corner of town," he said dryly. "Make sure you get home without finding anything unusual, okay?" "Okay," she said amiably. "And if I do find something odd, I just won't tell you about it. That will make you feel better." She hit the end call button on her phone and dropped it into her pocket, grinning like a fool. At least her life held more laughter now. And more love, come to think of it. Especially with Nan around the corner and her 3 pets at home. It was lovely to spend so much time with her grandmother. Doreen didn't realize how much she'd missed having family in her life all these years. Only as her marriage broke apart did she understand just how isolated she'd become. That had been the way her former husband had wanted it. And she apparently had been a willing victim to all his ploys. Or a blind dupe. As she looked back on it, it made her angry to see how much she'd lost over the years. Would it have hurt him to let her see Nan more often? Of course it wouldn't have. But he didn't like sharing. And would it have hurt her to stand up to him more often? Maybe, but it would have been better for her and Nan in general. Doreen turned the corner onto the path behind all the properties that led to the creek. The path was barely walkable since it was so overgrown with greenery. She idly contemplated what it would take to cut it back, but then realized more people would use it, and she didn't really want that. She liked having the place to herself. She could cross the creek at a couple places with the low water levels, and, given a choice, she always wanted to be on the far side, away from the properties. It was nice to know that this chunk of nature was just a few steps away from civilization. She whistled as she walked. She might not have any money and she might not have a job, yet she smiled a whole lot more than she'd ever smiled before. She shoved her hands into her pockets, her fingers wrapping around the small roll Nan had given her. She pulled it out and frowned. Nan. Nan had slipped her a $100 bill rolled up tight. Doreen carefully unrolled it, disconcerted, and yet smiling. Thanks, Nan. I could use the money. I really wish you didn't feel like you had to do this, though. It was such a kind-hearted gesture on Nan's part that it almost brought tears to Doreen's eyes. She didn't remember Nan being so generous in the previous years, but then Doreen hadn't needed the money while married. Now, of course, $100 was huge. It could pay bills and buy food. Just the thought of food made her want to head back into town to pick up something more substantial for her meals. Cheese and crackers wouldn't hold her for long. What she really needed was to deal with the devil stove. She picked up her cell phone and quickly dialed Nan. When there was no answer, she left a message saying, "Thank you so much for the gift, Nan. I really appreciate it. I wish you didn't need to help me, but, considering the facts of my new reality, I do need it right now. So, it's much appreciated." Doreen walked the rest of the path, delighted with the extra bright ray of sunshine in her world. As she got back to her property, she crossed the small bridge and ambled through her backyard. The sight of the downed fence made her wince. I should have done more work cutting this apart today. But she hadn't. She'd allowed herself to get distracted. She was too tired now to deal with it, plus the sun would be setting soon. As she walked up to her house, she realized somebody was inside. Her heart froze. She quickly ducked around to the side of the property. Muggs, sensing something going on, took one glance at the back door and growled. She knew how he felt. What kind of watchdog are you, Muggs? You were supposed to tell me before I found out. But of course, he ignored her. This time, he raced furiously to the kitchen door. Well, if she'd wanted to stay quiet and not let anybody know she'd arrived, that just went out the window. Thaddeus ruffled his feathers against her shoulder. She could tell from the look in his eyes that he wasn't happy either. Of Goliath, there was no sign. Figures. When trouble was brewing, he's not anywhere to be found. She sneaked around to the front of the house and stopped when she saw an appliance repair van. Was this guy looking at her stove? And who had let him in? Frowning, she stepped up to the front door and walked inside with Thaddeus, shutting the door and leaving Muggs outside, barking at the back door still. She carried on right through to the kitchen to find her stove pulled out all the way. A small wiry man lay on the floor beside and behind her oven. Thankfully, she could hear noises from the back of the stove and knew he wasn't dead. She stopped and said, "Hello?" A head popped up. A monkey of a man smiled a great big grin that split his face in two. She responded in kind. "Did you just walk in?" she asked him. He nodded. Of course. I had Mac's permission, he said. You weren't home and I figured you really needed this fixed, so I didn't want to wait. He frowned. I didn't take nothing. She stared at him. I'm just surprised and still adjusting to small-town ways. Muggs continued his guard dog barking at the rear kitchen door. Then Thaddeus strutted in, peering at the stranger. The repairman must not have thought either was unusual, as he nodded to her and continued with their conversation. Most everyone lets me come into their houses, even if they're not home. Mrs. B from 2 blocks over, she has me in regular. I'm pretty darn sure she expects me to clean the stove every time I'm there. So she calls me in to give it a quick tune-up, so she doesn't have to clean it. And Mr. Argon, over on the far side of town, he has me come in for his fridge on a regular basis. They leave messages, asking me to come by whenever. I pop around when I have a few moments. Most of the time they're not home. He spoke in such a confident tone that she had no doubt he told the truth. She shook her head. I spent a lot of years in Vancouver. His face twisted up in a grimace. That's a deadly place, that is. You need not only locks, but you need deadbolts. Couldn't imagine being a repairman in a place like that. Thaddeus walked right up to the repairman. Absent-mindedly he stroked Thaddeus softly. This acknowledgement must have placated the bird, for he flew off to check for any birdseed or table scraps on the kitchen table. You need security clearance to get into houses there. The repairman shook his head and plunged back down behind the stove, his voice wafting out from the space. So your stove is almost dead, he said. She walked closer, staring at the thing in front of her. Almost dead? She hated to ask, but she hadn't been aware it was alive in the first place. She knew Mac would be having a heyday with her right now. Yeah. You need to get a new one. I might be able to keep this thing going a little longer, but I wouldn't count on it. And just when I was figuring out how to use it, she said humorously, I haven't the money to replace it. Of course, he said in a surprise comment. Most of us don't. Repairs never happen at convenient times. She tried to figure out what he meant, or if he was just trying to make her feel better. He stood. I've got one in the store you can have for $100. She thought for a long moment. Did you give Nan a similar quote sometime in the last year? He nodded. A couple times. I told her that she was getting to the point where it couldn't be used anymore. But she always shook her head and said, it'll be fine. It'll be fine. It'll be fine, Thaddeus repeated, strutting atop the table. Doreen shook her head at the bird, but at least Muggs had stopped his barking at the back door. And I gather we've run out of the it'll be fine comments? He laughed. We ran out a while ago. In actual fact, you shouldn't be using this at all. But if you really don't have the money, maybe you could do without a stove for a while longer. He glanced around the kitchen. But this room's pretty clean, so I can see you're not really into kitchen gadgets. She wasn't at all sure what clean meant in this context, or what it had to do with kitchen gadgets. When she raised an eyebrow in question, he motioned at the long bare countertops. You don't have all your counters cluttered full of mixers and bread makers and rice cookers, he said by way of explanation. So you probably need the stove to cook with. She knew about a few of those things, and some of them appeared to be self-explanatory, but honestly they were almost appealing because if something could cook rice, and she didn't have to get involved in it, she was all for it. She loved rice. How much would some of that stuff cost? He looked at her in surprise. Well, secondhand, quite cheap. You'd probably get a rice cooker for $5. She stared at him. Someplace local? He nodded enthusiastically. A couple good thrift stores are in town. But you should come to my shop and take a look at what's available there first, so you know it works when you buy stuff used. My wife sells most of that refurbished stuff, so the stock changes all the time. I have a couple guys who work in the shop, repairing small appliances. I'm the only one who goes around to fix big appliances in people's houses though. I'd just as soon have the one you mentioned. What would it cost to have you deliver and install one of those? She waved her hand at the demon appliance things. The laughter in his eyes deepened. But now a curious light was in there too. As if she was adding to his list of curiosities in turn. I'll include installation in the cost of the stove for you. She nodded. Thank you. But I need to pay you for your time today as well, correct? He shook his head. Nah, I needed to come and see how bad this was. I've been telling Nan for years this one was dangerous. But she didn't want an electric one. Said she didn't trust those new gadgets. Doreen had no idea why an electric stove would be considered a new gadget. Electricity had been around for a long time. And it had to be way safer than an actual fire underneath a pot on a stove. That was too unbelievable. Yet that pretty well described Nan. Doreen really had to do something about this horrible thing. How long would it take to replace this one? The repairman frowned for a few moments, as if contemplating his schedule. If you don't need it today, I can probably bring it on Saturday. I need to make sure it's still available, and that my wife didn't sell it. Maybe when you get back to the shop, you can take a look and let me know. He nodded. He was fiddling with something in the back, and then all of a sudden he nearly whispered, "Oops. Yeah, this isn't going to work anymore." He held up some rigid cable-looking thing. The attachment on this end is bad news. Bad news. Bad news, Thaddeus added. The repairman frowned at the cable, then the oven. I really don't want you using it again. She wasn't going to say she hadn't used it yet. What about the gas? No problem, he said. I'm a licensed gas fitter. I'll shut this down here. I think you're probably better off with an electric stove, unless you really want another gas stove, but they are more money. Of course we need the 220 power for an electric stove, he muttered, half under his breath. He hopped over the corner of the counter, now standing on the same side of the stove where she was, and carefully maneuvered it back into position. Isn't that kind of useless? You just pushed it back, and you'll have to pull it out when you bring another one. He looked at her in surprise and shrugged. I move these suckers all day long. Doesn't make any difference. I thought it would be easier on you if you didn't have to walk around it while you haven't yet made your dinner tonight. She nodded as if she understood what he was saying. And she did, if she followed his logic. He couldn't possibly know she really didn't do anything in the kitchen. He collected his tools scattered near the devil stove. I'll give you a shout when I can get back again. Maybe at that time you can decide what you want to do. I want the second-hand electronic one. Any chance we can do it for $100, taxes and delivery and installation included? Oh, and carting off this old one? Now Doreen knew why Nan had given her the money tonight. He tilted his head, hesitated, studying the stove. What the hell? Yeah, I can do it for that. But it has to be the stove I fixed. And if my wife has sold it, then I don't know where to get one for you right now, he warned. We also need to run a new electric line for the stove. How much for that? She asked hesitantly. Not sure, but it shouldn't be much. In these older homes, the breaker panel is usually in the basement or crawl space, he said with a smile. She nodded as relief flooded her stomach. In her current reality, she could do without the demon gas stove. But she probably needed one to eat properly, according to Mac. And surely it was cheaper than takeout, and a whole lot better for her to eat at home too. Plus the electric stove wouldn't scare her, so she might want to use it. The foods of her past were a long way away, but if she could make a simple decent soup, it would help her feel like she'd accomplished something and was broadening her menu choices. Within minutes, the repairman had packed up his bag and walked out the front door. Doreen followed him and relayed her thanks again. She found Muggs waiting quietly on the front porch. Obviously, he had given up on her opening the back door for him. She left the front door open for him as she stood on the front porch steps, realizing the crowds were gone. She glanced over at the repairman. "Was anybody out here when you drove in?" He frowned up at her. "Where?" She waved a hand toward the front yard, where all the looky-loos had been. "In the driveway and up along the road, standing and staring at my place?" He studied her as if she'd lost her mind. Maybe he hadn't heard the news about the recently solved murders. Some people refuse to read newspapers, saying it's all bad news and how they can get the highlights with a 10-second glance via the internet. Unfortunately, Doreen couldn't avoid the dead bodies she had found last week, or the nosy reporters and gossiping neighbors thereafter. "No, can't say there has been." He smiled. "Wait for my call." And he left. If he drove off out of the driveway a little too fast, maybe it was to be expected. He probably thought she was Looney Tunes. Then again, he'd been trying to get Nan to replace that stove for years. So he understood exactly how free-spirited Nan was and would likely think Doreen was exactly the same. Then a big yellow cat bolted out of nowhere and into the house. Goliath was back. Doreen sighed. "And this is my new life." As she turned to enter her home, a middle-aged woman walked up her driveway. She had a fierce determination in her step, as if she'd seen Doreen standing here. Doreen frowned at her, but it didn't seem to stop the woman. She came charging up the front steps where Doreen stood, numbly looking on. "May I help you?" "Yes." "You can stop asking questions about Betty Miles." The woman reached up and smacked Doreen hard across the face. Then she turned and left. Doreen stood in the open doorway, her hand to her cheek, tears in the corner of her eyes, staring at the retreating, indignant woman. She was middle-aged, plump, dressed in an old-fashioned skirt. Her shoulder-length hair bobbed with every step. "What the hell was that for?" she whispered. But Muggs and Thaddeus and Goliath had no answers.